Good morning, everybody, and Arun, I think the gratitude is on my side. This is a project quite after my heart because for the last 2 decades we have been agonizing about the pitiful state of China's scholarship in this country. And pitiful, maybe is putting it mildly. I think scholarship on China in this country is really quite pathetic. Not due to anybody specifically, no individuals in that sense, but it's a kind of a system that has evolved since we got independent. Our education system is very, and I think Liz will have a lot to say on that. Not very strategically planned. So when the Jawaharlal Nehru University came in and with Nehru's vision, School of International Studies, because India wanted to play this great role in the world, we actually built in a structural flaw, which was that the area studies, international studies, and the language component were put in two different schools. And although there was provision for language training within the area study, which was largely carried out within the School of International Studies, the problem was very often about how to actually bring in language in for a sufficient duration and in sufficient depth to be able to have them use language for the research. So this language training was done only at the MPhil PhD level. When students came to do their MPhil, after having done a master's, they could have done the master's in IR or in any other social science discipline, or even the humanities, and then they could come into the MPhil PhD program, and there was only 1 year, it was 2 semesters devoted to language. And that was all that they could do, in addition to all the other courses they had to do. And besides, in the second year of their MPhil, they had to start the dissertation. And the School of Languages, on the other hand, had a full-fledged BA and MA program. And students went in directly after school into the School of Languages. And consequently, they were sort of thrust into Chinese is a tough language to learn. And over a period of time, it was discovered that they had no time to do anything other than focus on developing their language skills. And they had a few tool courses thrown in. And these tool courses were by way of short, basic introductions to Chinese politics, history, culture, literature, economy. So they were almost like very basic introductory modules. And that was all that they had. And after their MA, some of them ventured into the School of International Studies to do their research. So their social science component was non-existent. And in SIS, the language component was non-existent for all extents and purposes. And so what we've had is basically this structural flaw which has carried on over a period of time. And those who are good in social sciences have within the university system no opportunity to do the language. And those who come from the language really do not have the time or space to immerse themselves into a disciplinary framework with all its methodologies, theoretical rigor, etc. And so Chinese studies has fallen between those two stools. And all efforts in the past have been in vain. That's one part of the structural problem. The other is that post-62, there was suddenly a kind of a wariness about anything to do with China. And so the study of China was never expanded beyond 2 or 3 main universities in this country. And Delhi had the JNU and the Delhi University. There was Shantiniketan, which had a very different historical evolution and trajectory, so they were strong on culture and literature, study of texts. So to the extent that there is sinology in this country, a little bit is happening in was it. So that persisted till about well into the 80s. Some changes start to happen with the end of the 80s, when there is a slight improvement in the relationship and the need to study China is being articulated. And mind you, this is against a backdrop of scholars, small group of scholars studying China, beating their heads against the bureaucratic and governmental structures to expand Chinese studies. And for a variety of reasons, this was unfortunately not done. Today, as we realize the mess we are in, there is this refreshing breath of air that came in when we first got in touch with Ruby about the need to spread China studies, and the fact that we would have some of the best advice and assistance coming from HYI to help us do this. And so this workshop essentially would, if its objectives can be fulfilled, go down in history as you know, a kind of a landmark which actually began, because I see that you are from different parts of the country and all of you appear to be committed to starting courses on China. And these are not just only India-China focused. There are a lot of people who would like to do literature and economy and political science and social history. So that would actually be a major step in generating the interest. Partly we have managed to attend to the problem of inadequate resources and just inadequate structures because of the opportunities that China has offered. Today, last 5 years in fact, our students are able to go to China, stay there for varying lengths of time, have access to those resources in terms of the experts and other library resources and all. And that's entirely due to the Chinese. They are offering our students scholarships. They've opened up their universities to students from all over the country, and they're teaching in English. So the last 2-3 years has seen a very welcome addition to the large number of students who are going to China. I mean, so far the largest component has been going there to study medicine. But now you have students going in to study a variety of subjects. And this is because the Chinese are offering us scholarships, the possibility of not having to immediately deal with the language because there are English language instructors. And not only that, they are calling faculty from all over the world. Some of the best minds on China, from Europe and the United States, even West Asia, are scattered around Chinese universities. And they are offering a rather comprehensive kind of perspective on study of various subjects. So the point I'm trying to make is that we are now tasked with this very important objective to spread interest on China, make Chinese studies something that the students want to take up. Because unless you want to study China, you're not going to be able to put in the effort to do the language. And so I think these initial courses that you will be offering will be the first step to generating that interest. And it's important that we structure our courses in a way in which they become attracted to study China. It's not just about telling them that, well, you know, you're not going to be looking around for jobs if you do this. The moment you do this, you'll see a number of now avenues and niches where people who know anything about China are required. So it's not just that employment opportunities are not going to be a problem, but that you want to dedicate a lifetime to the study of this country. There's no now point in making a case about the need to study China. Now this need is very much in the air. We realize how, morning only Cynthia was saying that we have Chinese journalists who say China doesn't know anything about India, India doesn't know anything about China, and yet we are going to have to engage increasingly. So that that is the background really which makes me truly appreciate this workshop and your enthusiasm in particular. So I'm really going to be talking about the India-China interface and whether we, what really are the kind of ways in which we can think about this interface and devise courses around it. I think universities now outside India are actually offering courses on comparative India-China, on India-China relations. The importance of this relationship, both within the realm of international relations as well as disciplinary comparative studies, is now really taking off. And so a lot of people around the world are actually studying these two countries, and we are obviously not doing it sufficiently seriously. So how would you, from your particular standpoint, like to conceptualize a course on India and China? Clearly, one immediately thinks in terms of the contemporary phase, that the emergence of the Republic of India in 1947 and the PRC in 1949, and the beginning of their relationship as independent nation states. Now, the difficulty with that kind of a starting point is that it completely skews the way in which we are looking at the India-China relationship. Inevitably, the nation-state framework becomes a kind of a straitjacket. Sure, we may make references to the history and the glorious civilizational interaction, the fact that these two are the great civilizations which have shaped Asian systems, Asian institutions, Asian politics and so on. But that's done in a very pro forma kind of a manner. And I think what we need to do is rethink this nation-state framework. A very well-known scholar, Prasenjit Dwara, now located in Duke, long ago had written this book on rescuing history from the nation. And essentially his point was that the nation state actually then undermines the way in which historical connections need to be understood. That you, instead of coming from there to the present, you are going from here backwards and imposing certain kind of understandings. For instance, there was no India and China as we understand it today in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So how to actually talk about India-China relations in the present, but without this straitjacket? So we'll come to that in a bit. But one more very recent book that you all would do well to pick up if you're thinking of a course on India and China is by an Indian scholar, Professor Tansen Singh. He is located in Columbia, New York. It's called the India-China Institute. It's a new school in New York. And another Indian. So all the Indians are doing good work, but not in India. They're all located abroad. So now Tansen is has long been arguing about this problem of looking at India-China from this nation-state framework. So his book, which is just off the press, is called India, China and the World, A Connected History. Now, it's a fascinating book, and what it basically tells you is that this nation-state framework, which essentially makes one look at India-China in a largely bilateral kind of a way, is actually quite counterproductive. Because what it does is it makes you somewhat, not quite oblivious, but it perforce reduces the importance of the kind of interactions that have actually brought India and China to where they are. Now he takes it back, of course, to the communism. He's sort of saying that by the time we come to 1947 and 1949, we already have 3,000 years of interactions. And these interactions have not just been about two countries directly or two areas or two regions, but it's also about how India and China are connected to each other through movements, through travelers, through objects, through the spread of ideas, not just between them, but from various parts of the world throughout Asia. And so the India-China connections have been happening all over the world over a period of spanning so many centuries. And it's important to see that these connections have made the relationship so complex. And we seem to be focusing only on one aspect. So he says, so if you look at, he's divided it into about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of broad historical swats. And he uses different terms. He says, let's not say India and China. So if we are talking, say, of a specific historical period, so you will say that whichever dynasty it was, Song, Tang, China, and so on, and a particular region within India. It's problematic, of course, because you have to keep decluttering your mind. But starting from before the Common Era up to about the 15th century, he says that there were enormous amount of circulations and connections. So the beginning phase, he says that there was this enormous circulation of knowledge. So knowledge of geography, manufacturing technologies, astronomy, medicine. All these ideas were going back and forth. And as I said, when I'm saying back and forth, don't just see it in terms of between two areas, but we are looking at these movements all over the Afro-Eurasian kind of thing. And this is all happening before the advent of the European colonial powers. Then we have another period which is before the colonial powers come in, which is roughly from the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries up to the 16th century. And that's the period when explosion in maritime networks, connections, ports, hubs, starting with the very famous admiral in Chinese history, Zheng He, 1403 to about 1450 period. And he made these voyages across the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and so on, and opened up new ways in which India and China were interacting. So this maritime, this opening up of the maritime. The early colonialists, the British coming in, starting to do their shenanigans. Indentured labor, both from India and China, being taken across Asia, where the British colonies were, right up to the United States. And so India and China are interacting with each other in Malaysia, in the Malay Peninsula. So that's another dimension. And then, of course, during the colonial period, there were many shared experiences of exploitation, of immiseration, and so on. So this is up to, so from the 16th to the 19th, you have yet another kind of interaction happening at different parts of the world in different kinds of contexts. And then, of course, the early 20th century. Early 20th century, there were many different kinds of strands where the Indian and Chinese were engaging with each other. The whole framework of Pan-Asianism, which comes in the wake of the anti-colonial movements, brought India and China together. They were supposed to be looking at, they were supposed to be playing leadership roles in bringing this Pan-Asian movement. Of course, ultimately, many problems happened, it failed, the rise of Japan, no less the beginning of the India-China problems as a result of the legacy of the British in Tibet. So that really put an end to the fledgling pan-Asian movement. But by the middle of the 20th century, we have the two countries facing each other as nation states, with all the imperatives of the nation state framework, most dominant being the territorial sovereignty and its issues. So when we start to look at India-China, I think it's important to start looking at the way in which it's not, in which we have to broaden the scope of understanding the nature of the languages. The statist framework and the undue focus on state-to-state relations has really left this entire thing in the penumbra of kind of very obsessive focus on the nation state. So that's what I want to begin with, and I think that we have now a large number of writings, not something as comprehensive as Tansen, but from here you can actually branch out into looking at different elements of this relationship as it existed between scholars, academics, culture persons, specific kind of experts, movements of people, travelers interested in knowing about each other, religion, Buddhism, and so on. So that's the first part of what I wanted to say, that we really need to now open this up. What would be the necessary abilities required for this is what we have to now focus on. I'll tie this up with the earlier point that I made, that we really need to think about offering courses on China or teaching China with the language component. I think we will have to plan them in such a way that even if you are not able to introduce full-fledged courses on China, you will still have to bring in an element of the language. They have to start thinking about the need for the language simultaneously. And if you are going to be able to generate interest in these interactions and kindle their desire to learn more about these things, then eventually they will move towards the language. So bring that together. Okay, now so with that background, let's start to think about how and which part of the history would you like to reclaim or realize in teaching of China, or rather, which would be a more feasible way, because we have to do both things. We have to see what is possible and how you can go about it. Now, I think there are 2 or 3 ways in which you can juxtapose India and China in some kind of course. And depending on the background and depending on your own area, you could think in terms. See, the first would be what we might call the relational juxtaposition. So we essentially look at the factors which are bringing China together, or also potentially those factors which are keeping them apart, or even maybe taking them to a kind of some kind of a competition or a clash or whatever. So there are these 2 kinds of relational juxtaposition. And this essentially comes out from the larger IR question. So those who are interested in the IR part of it, that why do states really come together? Why do states cooperate? Why do states have conflict? And in that sense, we can look at 3 possible dimensions. And traditionally, IR looks at this question of why do states cooperate from 3 dominant theoretical frameworks, the realist, the liberal, and the constructivist. So the realist perspective would be looking at questions of power, that in other words, states either come together or conflict because of power agglomeration or improving their relative bargaining position and so on. So that's one perspective. The liberal would talk in terms of states come together and cooperate to enhance opportunities, to expand the range of their options for their interests, their objectives. And finally, the constructivist approach would talk in terms of looking at state cooperation or conflict, in not conflict so much, but the constructivist emphasis is on looking at the way in which states come together to build community. So potentially we have these three large kind of perspectives. Of course, you could bring them all together within one particular broad course where you are examining the way in which India and China are looking at each other. And typically, if you look at the gamut of the different ways in which India and China have interacted, you will see a bit of all. So it's not, you essentially would have to not look to one particular framework, but you would have to bring about a kind of eclectic framework to see how this relational element has worked itself out over the last 60 to 70 years. So we'll come to this relation. I mean, that's one whole separate lecture. But the second level at which you could do this juxtaposition is a conceptual one. So what we are looking at over the last decade in particular is this whole discourse of the rising power. China as the rising power, and then a new element which is India also has. So you'll see both things being argued. You'll see that people are arguing that India is also a rising power, and other people who are saying, well, but we're not rising as yet, we're an emerging power. So this IR discourse about emerging, rising powers, which is again part of a larger theoretical discussion of the transition kind of theories, is to do with the dynamics of China's rise and India's emergence. And so the question here really is that the kind of impact that these two rises, or rise and emergence, will really have. So tendency is to sort of see the Chinese rise in terms of having a systemic impact. And arguably, China's rise has already had a systemic impact in world affairs. Whereas India's impact is more as a potential. That as India gets its own growth story, right, and as it becomes much more richer and more developed power, that it will also have a major impact on the structural aspect of international relations. So this is one way in which one can juxtapose it, to see the different ways in which China's rise and India's emergence is affecting global, regional structures, as well as how it is affecting the bilateral element. A third way in which I think we could, I think there's an interesting argument which my colleague at the SIS makes. He teaches IR there, Balasani, and so his argument is an interesting one, which he's trying to explore, which is that does one see this as a structural problem or a temporal problem, or how do you start to understand this? And his so the interesting point that he makes is that China's rise, which is obviously out there and everybody knows it's happening and there are no questions about it, is actually masking India's rise. the fact that India is also rising, that India is also making its own mark and its own in its own manner, it's affecting, making some impact, is actually not being focused on. And so, while the resistance to China's rise, which is coming from the established, entrenched major powers, is essentially focused on China, so India is getting the space in which it can grow. So its own rise is not, of course, at one level it's not seen as threatening a fashion as China's rise, but so that's why we just something he's working on, and I thought. Final thing would be a comparative juxtaposition. And I think here is where we are having potentially the most interesting set of areas to examine and possibly think in terms of what you would like to teach now. With India and China comparative studies, it's, I think, a very fascinating kind of juxtaposition. Because for comparative studies to be really fruitful, I mean, it's like they have to be significantly similar to be fruitful, but also significantly dissimilar to be worthwhile. And I think in India and China you have that kind of a combination, that there are significant similarities. You go across the economic, the cultural, the rural, urban, there's plenty of similarities, and yet you have plenty of dissimilarities. So I think this is, and this is really an entire realm waiting to be explored. Very, very few systematic, theoretically grounded, rigorous comparative studies on India and China in any dimension. The economy has managed to now capture a lot of people's interest, and so the last 10 years has seen some production of books on India-China economy. The hare and the tortoise, the elephant and the dragon, and it's all in terms of the different capabilities of the two countries to achieve levels of economic growth, development, modernization. But even those studies, I would argue, are not so much in terms of a structural comparison of the economies in the two countries. It's more in terms of their linkages with the globalized world, their capacities in industry and agriculture and so on, service sector, knowledge economy, primary, tertiary sector. So it's more in terms of comparing just the overall structure, but it's not in terms of actually getting down to what is it. Now, for instance, I take a political economy course in GL, and so we come to a point where we are looking at the 1990s in China, and suddenly you see that after the reforms that Deng Xiaoping initiates in 1978, the 80s are a fairly up and down kind of phase, culminating in the Tiananmen, which was quite a shocker in the world around, of course. But from the 1990s, 91 and onwards, we see China like taking off. It suddenly starts to, and by the end of the 90s, we've already started to talk about how China is rising. In early 21st century, China is reaching from 8th to 5th to 3rd place in the global economic order. Now, question is, till well into the 80s, roughly till the mid 1980s, thereabouts. So that's where the divergence starts to happen. China and India are neck to neck. Maybe in some aspects, India was doing better in one or two aspects, particularly service sector was already by the mid 80s ready to take off, and China's came much later. But what is it that made the difference? That China, and mind you, 1991, India embarks on its own economic reforms. So what makes the difference that China takes off in the way it does, and India not only cannot take off, but starts to actually fall behind China significantly, and by the turn of the century, you can see that difference between India and China is already huge. Today the argument is, are we 15 years behind China or 20 years behind China? It's that is taking more interest rather than why is it? What are the factors which led to China's success? And this is something that requires in-depth. Similarly, things like poverty reduction, or education, leaps that China makes in education. Of course, it starts to fall behind in health sector, for instance. A story that unfolds in the 1990s, particularly urban, countryside, and all, is rather mixed. So we need to see this totality and look at what's happening in India at the same time, because roughly both countries are becoming more and more integrated into the global economy over the course of the time, and yet such different results. One or two factors are there, but of course those are. So I think this comparative juxtaposition is something that can offer huge scope for and it will help, I think, if you can, because you all are located in this country, so if you offer courses on a comparative aspect and bring India and China, I think that might be also a way to in the short run, deal with the kind of problems that you may have in terms of resources or access to various things. But this comparison can always be first step. And it could be done at whichever level that you would like to look at, global, regional, bilateral. Okay, so that is the way in which we can. So shall we stop here for some questions and then get on to the relational aspect?
I was just stuck there. Can you please explain a little bit on the constructivist approach in IR?
So essentially the constructivist approach is about socializing behavior and from the perspective of building international communities for address. Either it's, again, the starting point is, why do states cooperate or compete for that matter? And so contrary to the power explanation or even the totally interest-based explanation which the liberals have, the constructivists actually talk about common and shared objectives which actually help the community as a whole. And that's really that you're coming together not just because of to put it in a very bland fashion, not just national interest, but enlightened interest. So essentially you are thinking in terms of community interests, and by here I mean global communities. You can have global communities in climate change and against certain kind of natural disasters and also the cooperation for common objectives essentially brings about a fundamental transformation in thinking, which then shapes the way in which newer structures are constructed.
As a part of Indian foreign policy, I have to teach about India-China relationship. So what you made, the points that you made about constructivist theory and how we should look at, and that's one way we look at the India-China relationship. My point is, my observation is that in India, we look at China in a very constructivist way only. We don't really look at it in the realist perspective, apart from the time when the government is looking at it. It's not so much as a realist perspective. When we are teaching, all of us are teaching, it's more of a constructivist approach. We are looking at the history of the Chinese historical relationship between China and India, and of course Nehru's belief in the Chini Bhai Bhai, all of that. that seems like a constructivist approach. I don't think we look at, but that's just my observation. My other point is, and you said we should get out of the state, nation state, looking at it in a very nation state way. The problem is Indian government, when you look at the way Indian government looks at China, it's a very state-centric approach. In most of the studies that Indian government does in either manufacturing, maritime industry, maritime strategy, anywhere you look at, they have, in the government studies that are put out, there is a comparison to China. They're not comparing themselves to any other country but China. And I am just amazed at why India is looking only at China. And because India is looking, Indian government is looking at China, they should have already done this Chinese studies approach. Should have had Mandarin experts already. So if they are not doing it, where are we lagging behind? What? I just don't get it amazes me that we don't do that already.
Okay, so the first thing that you mentioned was that we look at China from a constructivist perspective. I don't think so. Okay, now there's a slight, let me nuance this a bit. That when we say we are looking at China, then we make a distinction between people who are studying China or teaching about China, or those who are dealing with China, business and so on and so forth. That's a separate group of people. And there is one which is looking at state-to-state relations and how that relationship is being pursued, how policy is being made, what are the kind of factors which impinge upon the decisions for cooperating in this, that or the other, what are the factors which are creating other kinds of tensions and so on. So the typical study of the foreign policy of a state. Now, the difference is that when India is looking at China, that's why the point I made was that, and this is the state, that we are studying state, the Indian state and India's foreign policy vis-a-vis China and China-India relations. So the point I did make was that it's very difficult to straight or buttonhole it into either a realist or a liberal or a constructivist framework. That we see elements of all three dimensions working itself out in India's policy towards China. So we talk a lot about this trust deficit and how there is a threat perception in India vis-a-vis China, and that's where the power factor comes in. That's where you see a very strong assessment being made of what's the nature of this threat and what should we do to meet the threat, what are the kind of alliances we should have, what are the kind of frameworks we should be into and so on. Liberal, yes, I think the whole economic commercial realm is offering interesting opportunities for trade and commerce, and already I think the economic aspect of the relationship, particularly if we look at the last 20 years, has been one of the most dynamic components of the overall relationship. And a constructivist as well, because what we are looking at are India and China increasingly coming together on multilateral platforms, moving towards the creation of new institutions at the regional level, particularly the Asia Investment, Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, the BRICS Bank, BRICS itself, SCO, RIC. No, so there are a range of multilateral platforms on which India and China are now engaging and maybe thinking in terms of how to formulate policies in a collective manner for addressing specific concerns, specific issues. So you see all of them, and therefore I think when we try and analyze India-China foreign policy or India's foreign policy towards China, we need to be able to pick out these strands. And yet we have to ask ourselves the question, what is India's strategy towards China, or where is India-China relationship heading? And that's where your second part comes. That it's essentially about a China focus in a very unproductive manner. Because what we are doing is we are looking at China with a competitive lens. So how is it doing better than us in this or that, but studying why they did it. What are the things that made for their success but may not make for ours? What are the things we should learn and not learn? These elements are missing. So it's about a competitive aspect. And as you know, both leaders on both sides are talking about there's enough space for both of us to grow. So yes, they're acknowledging that there will be a competitive element, but it needn't worry us because there is enough space. So you can do your thing and we can do our thing. So there are, I think, problematic aspects in the way in which policy is being pursued. Now, the other problem that comes up is that as scholars, when we look at the course of the relationship, we see that 62 becomes a kind of a disruption. Almost all of the literature on India-China relations that has emerged in the last 30 years will talk about this great disruption. That things were very, very idealistic before that, and this becomes the reason for the two countries to go apart, and then the fallout as it happens across a range of sectors, not just foreign policy, but in terms of domestic policies as well. So yes, this is the dominant explanation for the fact that Sino-Indian relations have not been able to build on the promises of the 50s, even if we don't follow that very idealistic kind of a thing. And the next lecture I will take you through this whole process. But the problem is that therefore it becomes almost a fundamental problem as to how to interpret 1962 in terms of the totality of the relationship. Scholars are now doing very interesting work on the nature of the engagement between India and China in the 50s. And it's not just that there was this great idealistic bye-bye thing happening, that there was a lot of exchanges that had begun to take place between India and China in educational fields, in technological cooperation, in cultural engagements. So there's a young scholar in Harvard, I think, Aruna, who's doing a fascinating exploration of what's happening in the 50s. And trying to show that it wasn't as if it was only this statist kind of a dimension to the relationship, that it was only about Nehru deciding that India and China would be brothers, and then saying, even Nehru's own writings, okay, Srinath Raghavan has written a recent book, and there's also, the book came out last year in August, and there's also the, Teen Murthy has compiled Jawaharlal Nehru's correspondence of the late 50s, which again throws up very interesting duality in Nehru's own approach to China. He's saying that, look, we need to be aware of the dangers that China poses. Now mind you, he does not say communist China. To that extent, Nehru is not really following the systemic kind of a conflict that characterized international relations, the bipolar kind of divide. But he's saying that China is a threat. He's talking of Chinese expansionism. There's also that entire backdrop of the whole Asian resurgence, which was riven with its own contradictions. So I think somewhere we need to get out of that, very broad brush strokes, up to the 54 Panchsheel, Bhai, 57, 58 relationship starts to falter because the border starts to get alive. 62 the war, nothing happens, then slowly. Because the engagement is continuing, and I think this is a testimony to the kind of history that I was talking about, that there are these, the problem with the state, not the statist perspective, because that's there, the problem with the state domination is that it controls the way in which these linkages are operating now. So yes, there will be very little permission for scholars to engage freely or move across. Visas for Chinese experts are a nightmare. You try and organize a conference on China in your schools, in your colleges and universities, and you'll see you'll be a nervous wreck by the end of it, wondering whether you'll be able to hold the conference. Visas will never come in time. There's a whole lot of one of my colleagues in Kolkata, Jadavpur University, who's putting up this conference. Sorry, not Jadavpur, Kerala University. And he's saying that we've gone 3 scholars and we've just got the political clearance, but we don't know whether the security, you need 2 levels of clearances for being, for making the Chinese scholars eligible to apply for visa. So first you got to get political clearance, which is the Ministry of External Affairs. They will say, we have no objection, political objection to your hosting the conference. Then you need a security clearance, which comes from the Ministry of Home Affairs. So they go into their data set and see whether this man ever had anything to do with any Chinese intelligence agency or party, or if he is connected with what kind, all sorts of questions. So finally, when they are sure that it's not a problem, then they say, okay, security clearance given. On the basis of those 2 clearances, the Chinese scholar can apply for a visa. They say at least 45 days in advance. But till the 43rd day, you don't know whether you'll get your clearance or not. So this problem about the restriction on engagement at the societal level is what is blocking the avenues for both the contextual as well as the comparative juxtapositions. I think that's and somewhere I think our study of the India-China relations has to keep the foreign policy component very small. Yes, the states are engaging each other. A bit of that. I think that's the least interesting of issues.
Since you made a reference to Kerala University and the seminar, the problems that they have, I wish to mention 1 or 2 things about Kerala-China relationship, which goes back to 12th century. Even now, when you look at Kerala website, Kerala is generally promoted as God's own country. If you look at the website, you will find the China connection that Kerala has through the display of Chinese nets.
Yes.
Even now, Kerala celebrates its friendship with China by projecting Chinese net. This is one instance. I will not elaborate on that. Another one is, before Fakian, we have a Chinese trader, Zheng Ho, who came to Kerala for trade, and then he fell in love with Kerala, and he wanted his remains to be buried in Kerala. So his burial ground can be seen in Kozhikode in Kerala. So another thing which the Chinese scholars also acknowledged 2 years ago, Kerala History Council members, they met with the Chinese delegation. They came with records of the presence of the remains of Zheng Ho in Kerala. The third thing I would like to mention in this context is, there is a movie called Zuli, which narrates the story of a Malayali family which went to China, settled down in China 700 years ago. For 14 generations they have been in China, but they retain the records of their Malayali roots. So a documentary has been made on the saga of this family, 700 years of history in which they have settled down in China, and then they still remember their Malayali roots. I don't know the exact location. I can share the movie link. It's a documentary. I wanted to download the movie and then show parts of it today. The problem was it was not accepting my card. Card details had to be entered. I can give you the links if you are interested about it.
Now, I've seen this.
Thank
It's
you.
actually this documentary has been made by a young faculty who's currently teaching in Chennai IIT. He's doing a course on China. His name is Joe Thomas. In fact, he's my PhD student. And so it's interesting because he picked up this fragment. Unfortunately, the records are, they're just not getting available to him. He's got a fragment, but it's very interesting what he did with that fragment, and he used his own resources, and in fact he shot it on his own, and everything he's done. So it's a kind of literally a one-person effort with some friends from tech background who helped him put music and then sound and stuff like that. But it's a very interesting, instance of the circulations that I was talking about. And when we have students coming from, say, Kerala to JNU, or those who are coming from Odisha to JNU, having done their graduation, post-graduation in Odisha or Kerala, or even those coming from Mumbai, their whole perspective is very different from those who are, say, let's say, located in Central India, North India. And their concern is more to look at issues which relate to some of this history, and not so focused on only, relations, like a patent of the India-China relation 72 to 79, and the next one says 84 to 99. That kind of a approach is missing. They like to look at issues which will somewhere, maybe these things they've heard about and read about. So interests are different. Perspectives also, they will pick up perspectives which are also very different. So it's something to do with the vastness of India, different kinds of experiences that are there in different parts, and I think we should bring this together.
I have a feel, I'm not from history or political science or international relations field, I'm from literature. So when we launched a program on China, understanding China through literature, there was great enthusiasm. We were planning to accommodate 25 students and we had nearly 300 applicants. So we had to narrow down. So that shows the interest. So I think the arrival of the British and then the Portuguese later, all these things must have affected the continuance of India-China relationship, especially from the Kerala context. So certain imperatives in history must have taken us away from China. But then the kind of ethos that go deep into the Kerala mind, that remains there. So now, even now, despite what happened in 1960s and the tensions and the kind of strife that India has had with China, I think even now the Malayalis wouldn't look at the Chinese as, the other, or maybe the enemy, well, if I may use a very layman's terminology. So it's a kind of climate that we have in our part of the state. Thank you.
Why is India so scared of Chinese scholars? Because I work along with the Chennai Center for China Studies, and then each time we organize a conference, you said that it's by 43rd day that you will get to know, but again, my experience is even on 45th day you would get to know first. Big problem is, each time we think about starting a China's course, earlier when Mr. D.S. Rajan was there, when he was on, we wanted to start this course. When we started the course, the idea was just behind us. Why do you need to do this? The same experience also with the VIT, Vellore Institute of Technology. They wanted to have Confucius Institute, and the government of India did not take it easy at all. They forced this VIT to stop it, but of course they started in a smaller way. Again, MCV tried doing something similar, doesn't work at all. Why is India so paranoid with scholars coming from China? And somewhere I find that they're okay with language teachers, Chinese language teachers coming from Singapore, not from mainland China. And I don't know, maybe I could be wrong. A lot of people tell us that people who come from Singapore, they may not be able to teach us the same way the Mandarin is spoke. Kind of is different. And then because of this, we have not been able to go forward with regard to Chinese language teaching at all. Why is India so paranoid?
We even now have a what called chinichatti, which is the button which we use for cooking. It came from China, which is called chinichatti, and chinawala is Chinese net again. So if we try to look at history away from the state, rescuing history away from the state, that's an interesting thing. Sanjay Subramanian says that if you look at history of Bengal, people cutting across border and looking at region, then it would be a fascinating history of the people, which well fit into this constructivist approach. But unfortunately, as he said, we are bound by this state-centric, straitjacket notion, where everything is looked at from a realist perspective, and the army decides, or the strategic state structure decides, where scholars are seen as a threat. I don't know how the language teachers are seen as a threat, and what kind of threat are we talking about. The second point is that it's a quite pitiable paradox. We want to learn about China, but we are restricting the flow of ideas. Where do you go? We want to know the China because it's next door, it is rising power, you name it, and then we are restricting the flow of ideas and scholars, and then saying that they are a national security threat. Come on.
Mandarin, not just teachers, but who are experts in Mandarin, who will study the local papers in China, then interpret it as to what is going to happen to India. I mean, how should India react? And surprisingly, he also said there's only one man who is good in that, and that person was Rajan, and he also passed away. And I don't know whether there is anybody who's there who can read the local Mandarin news and then interpret it for India.
What Jacob sir and then Biju sir, just to add, I come from Kalimpong, West Bengal, and then Kalimpong, as my grandfather narrates, had the first Chinese school where Chinese language was taught. But because of the 1962 incident, the whole, I think the building was dismantled, and then these things happened. So again, I think that constructivism things gets distorted when the politics and the state issues enters. And then the whole Tenepla Pass, which is there in Kalimpong, the Pedong side, it's all, I mean, after 1962 it's blocked.
It's a major contact zone.
Yeah. Silk Route. Yeah, old Silk Route.
Look, two things that happened in the last 2 decades, over 2 decades, okay? And of course, we start with the fact that China studies, and that's how I began by saying that for a number of reasons, but more specifically because of this war, the way in which it affected the country and its psyche. And when I say country, I mean essentially the government, the leaders, the elite. Of course, people were affected in a different way. I mean, there was this whole discourse of the betrayal. Pandit Nehru spoke about how the Chinese had stabbed him in the back. So there was one book which had come out some time back. I forget, it was written by a journalist, and he interestingly responded to it by saying that the Chinese did not stab him in the back. And this was again a very nationalist kind of a interpretation. They didn't stab him from the back, they stabbed him from the front. The problem was Nehru's eyes were closed. So, saying that he was blind to the dangers from China, and therefore this was bound to happen, and it happened. So there is that psyche on the, which particularly if you talk to the defense personnel, it's amazing how still that defeat rankles. I mean, they came in, they galloped us, and they went back. And it's not easy to get over something like that, because it's a psychological kind of thing. Though the newer generation of army people, I must say, are surprisingly efficient. That they are saying that, look, we need to move on, that this is a pointless kind of a waste of way in which we are being used. So that kind of thing is, you can talk to them about it. But so that's the impact on the psyche, on our collective imagination about China was there substantially. But when you look at what happened to the policy making, and when you look at its impact on the government, it actually becomes counterproductive. That instead of using that as an instance to know thy enemy, you actually decided to shut off the enemy. As a consequence, your entire northeast is kept deliberately underdeveloped. Look at that. I mean, we come to the problem of language and scholars at the end, that strategically you shut off all kinds of developmental activities, infrastructure building in the Northeast. 60 years later, people are saying, look at the difference between us and the Chinese. They've got 6-lane motorable roads right up to the border. We can't even access our borders. That's one element of that paranoia. That you thought that you could strategically deal with the Chinese by preventing them from coming. At the second level, it was reduction in the contacts. This is a similar kind of thing that you see happening with playing out with Pakistan, that unless you stop terrorism, we won't talk to you. So unless you resolve the border issue, no contacts. That then lasted from the policy perspective, that no contacts till we address the border problem. Fortunately, Rajiv Gandhi then reverses that. But then you begin to see a way in which slowly. But those scholars who had an opportunity to go to China, who went into the whole problem about the border, who examined the records, who did an objective assessment of what went wrong, why, given the limitations, you didn't have all the records, you didn't have the access to the most significant military assessment of the war, it's still under wraps. All these limitations, those scholars who studied it found that there was enough of a problem on both sides. That was not just all. And the moment this starts to be articulated, and scholars by the mid-80s and late 80s, some very well-known scholars of China in India start to talk about the fact that possibly India was also to blame. And that really becomes the start of the problem. Yeah, so last point. What is this gentleman telling me? You see, you scholars, you go and talk to the Chinese and this thing, and then you come back brainwashed. You start talking their language. You start saying things which you know are just not true. So I said, well, put out things which are true and we'll talk about them. You don't give us anything, etc., etc. Nut of it being that it's not that they are scared of the Chinese, they are scared of the Indians. And I'm not joking, because they do not like Indian scholars to come out with independent, objective, impartial assessments which may favor the Chinese. So you can, if you are talking nicely about the Chinese, you are anti-national. So we will stop you from talking to the Chinese because you guys get so brainwashed so easily. So the problem is us, not them. I think that's the